In a quiet corner of an old town, tucked between a bakery that smelled of warm bread and a bookstore that rarely changed its display, there stood a narrow little shop. Above the door hung a wooden sign that read, "Harrison and Time." Inside that shop worked an elderly man named Edward Harrison. Edward was a watchmaker. For over 40 years, he had repaired clocks, pocket watches, and delicate wristwatches that most people thought were beyond saving. His hands were steady, his eyes, though aged, were sharp. His movements were precise. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of time filled the shop every day. And Edward liked it that way. Because as long as he was fixing time, he didn't have to think about his own. Years ago, Edward had a son. His name was Thomas. Thomas didn't care much about watches. He cared about adventure, music, travel, new cities. Edward never understood him. "You should learn the trade," Edward would say. "It's stable. It's respectable." Thomas would smile politely. "I don't want to fix time, Dad," he once said. "I want to use it." Edward didn't like that answer. He believed discipline was love, structure was protection, tradition was security. So he pushed. Harder, stricter, colder. And slowly, Thomas stopped arguing. He stopped explaining. He stopped trying. Until one day, he left. No dramatic fight, no slammed doors. Just a quiet goodbye. "I need to live my own life," Thomas said. Edward didn't reply. He simply nodded and returned to his workshop. Years passed. Letters came at first. Short updates, new cities, small victories. Edward read them, but he rarely responded. He told himself he'll come back when he's ready. But Thomas didn't come back. And then, one winter morning, a letter arrived that Edward never expected. It wasn't from Thomas. It was from a hospital. There had been an accident, a long road, a tired driver. Thomas was gone. The shop never closed. Edward returned to work the very next day. Customers came, watches ticked, clocks chimed, and Edward repaired them all perfectly. But something inside him stopped moving. He never spoke about Thomas again. He never mentioned the letters. He never allowed himself to say the words, "I should have listened. I should have understood. I should have said I was proud." Instead, he blamed time. If time hadn't passed so quickly, if that night had been shorter, if that road had been different, he began to resent the very thing he worked with every day. Time. Edward became obsessed with precision. If a watch was 1 second off, he corrected it. If a clock ticked unevenly, he adjusted it. He believed that if he could control time perfectly inside his shop, he could silence the regret outside it. But regret does not disappear. It waits. One afternoon, a young boy entered the shop. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He held a broken pocket watch in his hand. "Sir," the boy said nervously, "this was my grandfather's. It stopped working." Edward examined it. The glass was cracked. The hands were bent. The mechanism inside was badly damaged. "It's very old," Edward said. "It may not be worth repairing." The boy's face fell. "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said quietly. "I just want it to tick again." Those words lingered. "It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want it to tick again." Edward sat down at his workbench. For hours, he worked carefully, replacing gears, cleaning dust, adjusting springs. The boy waited patiently. Finally, tick, tick, tick. The watch came back to life. The boy's eyes lit up. "Thank you," he whispered. Edward hesitated. "Why is it so important?" he asked. The boy looked at the watch gently. "My grandfather says time isn't something you control. It's something you share. Edward froze. Share. He had spent his whole life trying to control time, but he had forgotten to share it. That evening, after closing the shop, Edward did something he had not done in years. He opened an old wooden drawer beneath his workbench. Inside were Thomas's letters, carefully folded, slightly faded. He read them again, this time slowly. Thomas writing about a street musician in Paris, about a sunrise in Tokyo, about missing home, about wishing his father would understand. Edward's hands trembled. For the first time since that winter morning, he allowed himself to cry. Not because time had taken his son, but because pride had stolen moments he could never get back. The next day, Edward changed the sign outside his shop. He removed the small brass plate that said, "Precision above all," and replaced it with, "Time is meant to be shared." Customers noticed something different in him. He spoke more gently, listened longer, rushed less. When children entered the shop, he told them stories about adventures, about mistakes, about second chances. He could not repair the past. No tool could fix that. No gear could rewind it. But he could forgive himself. Not perfectly, not instantly, but slowly, like adjusting a delicate watch, one careful movement at a time. Years later, when people asked Edward what he had learned after a lifetime of repairing timepieces, he would smile softly and say, "You cannot rewind regret. You cannot pause loss. You cannot control time." He would look at the ticking clocks around him. But you can choose how you spend the moments you still have. And in that quiet little shop where watches ticked and clocks chimed, there lived an old watchmaker who once tried to control time, but finally learned to forgive it.